to the book of Esther. And we're going to begin tonight with chapter 5. The end of chapter 4 is really the basic turning point in the whole book. It's where Mordecai had instructed Esther to go to the king to plead on behalf of the people of God and herself. And she was very, very reluctant to do that, obviously for very good reasons. She hadn't been anywhere near the king for the last 30 days, and her thinking was, rightly so, that she had no idea what the king would do if she just presented herself before him. And if you remember, if you go before the king unannounced or unrequested by the king, you risk your life. The only exception would be if he raised his scepter to indicate to you that you were welcome to come into his court. But if you came unannounced and he didn't raise his scepter, you would be a dead duck, if you will. And so Esther was fearful about that, but then Mordecai convinced her by saying something very, very important, really for all of us who trust in the Lord. And he basically asked a question that should be a question we should all be wanting to ask of ourselves, as we pointed out the last time. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Now again, God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. Prayer is not mentioned in the book of Esther. They do fast, and there is going to be, as we had read at the end of chapter 4, a 3-day fast that was requested by Esther on her behalf before she goes and makes her appearance before the king. But she was very concerned about it, but she came to the realization that there was no other option. And when you're basically up against that kind of a wall where you can't go forward, and you look behind you and there's no way to turn back, and you look on either side and you're just completely engulfed by mountains on either side, then the only thing that you can do is go by faith. Not by presumption, but by faith. That's what the Israelis did when Moses raised his staff and said, "Stand and see the salvation of the Lord." They didn't have any option, but God did, and he parted the Red Sea. Well, for Esther and Mordecai and all of the Jews throughout the entire 127 provinces of Persia, they were up against a very, very serious wall that they could not pass unless God intervened. And it's why I think it's so amazing that this book doesn't even mention God by name. But God is in every single page of this great book. And we'll see that more and more as we move forward, and especially these next few chapters. But at the very end of chapter 4, again, Esther has resolved to go and do what Mordecai has requested. And she said, "If I perish, I perish." What a great heart this woman has for the Lord and for her people. And so does Esther. So does Mordecai have for his people as well. So chapter 5 begins with, after her having made that decision, and 3 days have passed. And it says in verse 1 of chapter 5, "Now it happened on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house." So he's facing the only entrance into where she would have to pass to get into his inner court. So he could see her if she makes her way into that area that is opening into his court, and that's precisely what she's about to do. It says in verse 2, "So it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court that she found favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter." Apparently, in the Persian culture, again, when he raised his scepter, that was such a wonderfully good sign for her. She could enter in and not fear the punishment of death. But her touching the top of his scepter apparently was an indication by her that she's accepting his grace and mercy. And then very subtly, when you look at this passage, think about the number of days that she had to basically think of herself as potentially being killed. 3 days facing death, and then coming into the presence of the king and receiving grace and mercy from the king instead of the death penalty. Does that remind you of anything that may have been something of your particular experience when you came to the Lord? Recognizing that he did this for you. He faced death, and in 3 days he was in the grave for 3 days. In 3 days he was raised again. And because he was raised again, God has given us the salvation through Christ's death, burial, and resurrection, so that we can enter into his presence and find his acceptance of us. The resurrection and the death of Jesus Christ were not really very specific in the Old Testament, but they definitely were presented in a type form, in a shadow, if you will, of that which was yet to come. All the way back to Abraham, we found Abraham traveling with his son Isaac for 3 days after God had told Abraham to offer his son as a sacrifice. He considered Isaac to be dead. And 3 days later, instead of taking Isaac's life, God allowed Abraham not to take his life, but spared him. And it's a type of the resurrection of the son. In the case of Abraham, the son wasn't killed. Of course, in the case of God, the son was killed, but raised from the dead on the third day. Another very similar type in the Old Testament regarding the resurrection was the story of Jonah. He was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days. And if you remember Jonah's prayer while he was in the belly of the fish, he considered himself to be in the depths of hell. And he, after 3 days, was vomited out by the fish, and he landed on the seashore in the northern Galilee region, and he was able to go from there to the place where God had originally wanted him to go to proclaim the news that he wanted to have proclaimed in Nineveh, all the way over to the land that is north of Iraq today in the territory of the Kurds. There's a long walk from the shores of Galilee, of the Mediterranean, but he went in kind of a resurrected sense from the death that he had thought he was going to suffer. So those are Old Testament examples of the New Testament reality of the death, burial, and resurrection of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Esther here is a small type of that same 3 days and then grace and mercy. And in a sense, resurrection from the dead, because she thought she would likely die, but she didn't die. She was indeed redeemed. So we find in verse 3, the king says to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to the half of the kingdom." That's another phrase, and it will be repeated twice more in this section that we're looking at tonight. But it's a phrase that is used in the New Testament as well by Herod Antipas. Remember when his wife Herodias told her daughter Salome to dance before the king on his birthday celebration. And she expected that Herod would offer some kind of a reward for her having conducted such a task as dancing before him and all of the people that were with him, in a drunken state, by the way. And he did ask, "What do you want?" Up to the half of the kingdom. It's a common phrase for kings to use, apparently, to imply, I am willing to give you whatever you ask because I know that you will ask something that won't be extravagant, but I'm offering you the half of the kingdom to indicate to you that I'm willing to give you whatever it is that you want. It's not really a blank check kind of a statement. It has its limits. But it is a very important thing that the king is offering such a thing to Esther because she does indeed have a very, very needful request that has to be given his positive response to. So Esther answered, it says in verse 4, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for them. And then the king said, bring Haman quickly, that he may go do as Esther has said. And so the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And at the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, what is your petition? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done. So again, he's prepared to give her whatever it is that she wants. He puts it into two separate categories. What is your petition and what is your request? And it's interesting that he puts it that way because she's going to make a twofold petition and request, but not this time. Esther is buying time. And I'm not really sure if perhaps she had a check in the spirit. If she had wanted to make the request at that particular time, it may very well have been the case. But she does not do it for whatever reason. And I think subliminally, the reason is God put in her heart not to ask yet. Now they're experiencing this banquet. It's a festive gathering of just the three of them, and it's a banquet of wine. There's no real meal here, and there won't be a meal even in the next day banquet that she invites them to, which is what is going to be her request here. But it's important to note, I think, that Esther has, for some reason, delayed her revealing what was on her heart. And we are going to find out just exactly what that reason was. Verse 7 says, then Esther answered and said, my petition and request is this. And then she says, in verse 8, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet, which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. So she's sort of half answering the king by requesting an extension of the same banquet feasting tomorrow, the next day. And then she will tell him all that is on her heart. That decision by Esther plays into the story directly. And it's a powerful example of God's hand moving behind the scenes. As we have said over and over again throughout the study so far in this book, it's so very, very evident that this is God. He's working his perfect will out in every single detail of this story as it unfolds. So verse 9 moves on to Haman's response to all of what's going on in this particular day. And he, by the way, though he's the second in command to the prime minister, he's a very proud man. You already know that. He's very proud, and we've seen that in his response to the fact that Mordecai did not bow to him whenever he passed by, as it was required of all the people in the kingdom. But he alone stood out as one who would not do that which was absolutely against his God's will and his own purpose and following after his own God. Well, that offended Haman very, very greatly. And Haman then responded, you may recall, I hope you do, by seeking the will of the king to allow him to send a decree out to all the provinces to destroy and annihilate a people that he said were a rebellious people, not naming them. And Ahasuerus said, yes, go ahead and do it. Gave him his signet ring to sign the petition that would go out to all of the various provinces. Now the king doesn't know at that stage, nor does he even know now, who that people group is. Mordecai knows, Esther knows, and of course Haman knows. So Haman has left this first day's banquet, and in verse 9 it tells us, So Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. Oh, he was so very, very excited. He had been invited to a queen's banquet by himself alone, and no others were with him. But something spoiled the party for him. The latter part of verse 9 says, "But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai." So he went from great joy to great anger in a moment of time. That is the way many people can move, even among friends and relatives. Shouldn't be the way that we are, but it is possible for us. But we also know that we have an advocate with the Father. And though it is sin for us to be angry and keep that anger beyond the setting of the sun, as Paul tells us, we know that if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness, even in times of anger and disappointment and disillusionment, times of discouragement where we doubt, times of sin where we fail. God is there, and our advocate is with him at his side. And though the Satan may come and accuse the brethren, our advocate stands on our behalf every time and intercedes on our behalf. What a great and glorious thing that we have for the promise that God will never leave us nor forsake us, and has always been willing to offer his forgiveness if we confess our sins. All of them, every day, any day, forever and ever, we have been forgiven. Sins are cast into the depths of the sea. He forgets them intentionally. Yes, God can forget, but he has to choose to do so. Verse 10 says, "Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home and sent and called his friends and his wife Zeresh." He wants to forget something that has just bothered him so much, and he's going to invite his friends and his wife to come and share this joy that he almost had lost, but now he's going to be getting it back. But he's got to puff himself up a little bit in order to do that. Look what he says about himself in verse 11. "Then Haman told them of his great riches." Well, they knew he was very wealthy anyway. He didn't have to brag about that, but he did. He said, "I just want you to know that I'm a very wealthy man." He also then said, "I want to tell you about my children." Talked about the multitude of his children. He was very proud of his 10 children. We're told that he has 10 children later on in the book of Esther. Everything in which the king has promoted him, including the high position that he has, and the fact that now he has advanced him above all the officials and servants of the king. That's a great honor for him. But it doesn't stop there. It says in verse 12, "Moreover," Haman said, "besides all of that, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared. And tomorrow I am again invited by her alone with the king." That is quite an honor indeed, Haman. You have surely been blessed, but you are so proud of it. You are so filled with haughtiness. And Proverbs chapter 16, verse 18 tells us very specifically, pride goes before a fall, or before destruction rather, and haughty spirit before a fall. That's going to happen in Haman's case. He's a great example of that fulfillment of Proverbs 16:18. But now he's feeling such great power, if you will, given to him, privilege, honor, and it stands out and fills his pride. But he complains nonetheless in verse 13, "Yet all this avails me nothing." All of these riches, all of these wonderful, great benefits that I've been given by the king and his queen, they are nothing to me because of this one thing. So long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate, he said, I am not happy. And it bothers me so much. I can't enjoy the blessings. I can't enjoy the wonderful things that the king has bestowed upon me because of this one man. It's eating him alive. Bitterness needs to be cut out at the root. If not, it destroys the whole plant. Let us never forget that. Don't let bitterness enter your soul. If it does, go to the Lord and seek his help to remove it. And sometimes it takes a very, very severe blow by a very, very sharp axe to cut it out at the root. But once it's done, it sets you free. It's wonderful. Haman did not know such blessing as this. All he could do was think about his hatred for Mordecai and his people. Verse 14 says, then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, now they're going to suggest something that he's going to accept as being a brilliant idea. This is it. Let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it, and then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. Now the word gallows is an English translation of the Hebrew, and it doesn't necessarily mean the kind of gallows that you may think of where we're familiar with a rope hanging. That is common in the East, rather in the West, especially in our early nation's existence. There were many hangings. They used to hang murderers. They found other ways to execute capital punishment, but capital punishment was a very, very commonplace in all of the European nations, but it wasn't common at all in Persia. And instead of hanging, what they did was they would impale the criminal on a sharp pole. I have seen a stone artwork of a Persian origin where a half a dozen people were actually tied to a beam at an angle like this. So the head was up here and the feet down here, and they were up, elevated off the ground, and the executioner would take a long pole and they jabbed the prisoner with that long pole. That's apparently what happened with this particular process that is being described here. They suggest that Mordecai be impaled by a pole on a very high platform so everybody could see it. That really pleased Haman. And so he had the gallows, or the structure, built 75 feet high, 50 cubits. That's a huge structure built in one day, but he's got the money to hire other people to do that. He made some contractor very happy that day. But he was pleased that it got done, so that when he the next morning went to the king to speak to the king about executing Mordecai, there's an overnight period of time that something else is going to take place that again is the hand of the Lord. And the construction of the gallows is the hand of the Lord behind the scenes, making sure that everything is in place as it needs to be in order for his perfect will to be accomplished. But God, I love that. Well, in verse 6, we find out what takes place overnight between that time that we just looked at and the time that Haman goes before the king. It tells us in verse 1 of chapter 6, that night the king could not sleep. I don't know how many times the king could not sleep. He may have had problems sleeping because of the weight of the kingdom that may have been very difficult for him to find the rest that he sought after. But this particular night was a night that was a special night of not being able to sleep. He couldn't even get enough Ambien to get to sleep. Nothing could help him sleep. So it tells us the king could not sleep, so one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Now, the Chronicles are just records of all of the decisions that the king would make during the course of every business day. And it was a large volume of many, many scrolls of these various records. It just happened that the one that went to get one of those scrolls happened to get a very particular scroll with a very particular record upon it. I've also thought about how boring it must be to have somebody read the minutes of the king's activities over any particular day, whether it was yesterday or 4 years before. But this particular record was long before, months before, the night that he asked for this record to be brought. He didn't ask for this particular record, he just asked for a record from the Chronicles. The servant comes with this record, and it tells us in verse 2, and it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Remember that part of the story given to us in an earlier chapter. Mordecai had overheard these two men discussing a plot to assassinate the king. He went to Esther and told Esther about it, and Esther told the king. The king had it investigated, it was proven to be true, and he had those two men executed. That was all recorded in this record of the Chronicles. But it says in verse 3, the king then said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who attended him said, "Well, nothing has been done for him. There was no record of anything done to reward Mordecai for such a high thing of great, deserving of great honor, but nothing had been given." So the king said in verse 4, "Well, who is in the court?" So by now, it's early morning. And guess who's coming to the court first thing in the morning to make his request before the king? You guessed it. Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. What a coincidence! He came at the exact same moment. Isn't that just simply amazing? Well, that's because our God is just simply amazing. He's orchestrated everything, every detail, every single element of this story. Behind the scenes, God is making sure it's all in place. You know, he stacks the deck, if you will, and I believe he's doing a very, very good job today, by the way, of stacking the deck. You know, the world is turning more and more against Israel. Have you read lately? Over and over again, daily, we're starting to see more and more countries agreeing with the ICC with regard to arresting Benjamin Netanyahu, making it so that it looks to them as it's right for the ICC to condemn him in a way that will be justified by world powers everywhere. And 4 nations in Europe have now agreed that's a good thing. They want to arrest Netanyahu so that they can remove his government and put in its place a weaker, progressive government that will allow Hamas to continue to reign in Gaza. Friends, that is not going to happen. God is in control. God is doing things. But God, he's doing a lot of stuff that the world doesn't ever see and probably won't ever see unless their eyes are opened. But that's the beauty of it all. We see because we know God's word. We know what's coming. We don't know when, we're not sure exactly how, but we see things being put into place. And when we look carefully and connect the dots, we realize, yes, indeed, God is in control and he's working out his perfect will. The players are being put into place. He puts kings into power and he takes them out of power. The king of Iran lost his life in a helicopter crash. Another king will be put in his place. This is God's work. He's removing one and putting another in place. The king of Saudi Arabia, of Arabia, is deathly ill. He's very old and has been suffering from pneumonia and a few other illnesses. We're not sure how long it will be, if he's going to live much longer, but Mohammed bin Salman is his designated heir to the throne. He's very much in favor of a negotiation that allows normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. His father is not. So as long as his father is alive, there's very, very little likelihood of Israel and Saudi Arabia coming together in agreement. However, our own country's president, along with Qatar and a few other nations, trying to convince Saudi Arabia to work with the Palestinian cause on their behalf and threaten Israel's normalization plans by making that alignment between Palestine and Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Arabia will insist, if you don't allow the Palestinians to self-rule, then there is no normalization possible. That's what President Biden, our president, is trying to accomplish. It's sick, it's evil, it's wrong, it's against God, but God is in control. Well, same way with what is going on with this story that we're looking at tonight. The story of Esther is all about the but God conditions. And the conditions that need to be in place are being made by his own choosing and in his own time. So Haman has come just at the right time. The king has been unable to sleep on the right night, and Esther postponed her request until after these events have been played out. It's all part of the story. Mordecai will not go to the gallows. We'll see that in a moment. Obviously, you knew that, but that's how God is working this plan to bring it to fulfillment. Verse 5 says, the king's servant said to him, well, if Haman is there, standing in the court, and the king said, well, let him come in. And so Haman came in, and before he could get his request out, before he could begin to make that request to give him permission to kill Mordecai on that gallows that he had built, he comes in, and the king asked him immediately, Haman, I want to ask you a question. Quick, answer me. This has been bugging me. I want you to give me your opinion about this. So Haman had no opportunity to speak at all. So the king goes on with this request. He says, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now, when Haman heard those words, he immediately thought, because he's already puffed himself up so much, and he's so very prideful, and he's already the great second in command, who else but Haman would be the one that King Ahasuerus would want to honor? And that's what it says. King asks again, what shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, well, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? Oh, it's obvious, Haman, you're the man. Yeah, all right. Let me think about this, king. Oh, I've got an answer. And boy, does he give a really wonderful answer. He thinks for himself, but it's not. Verse 7 says, and Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king is ridden, which has a royal crest placed on his head. The horse itself has a royal crown on his head as he leads the king in a procession. He's saying, let there be the man's receipt of this royal garb and have him sit on the king's royal steed. And then he says, then in verse 9, let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of the one of the king's nobles, princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. And then parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Poor Haman, he thinks this is all for him. He thinks that this is what is going to happen to him next, and he's so full of excitement and wonderful joy at the prospect of being able to be paraded throughout the city as a high honor is bestowed upon him. Then the king said in verse 10 to Haman, hurry, you're the one who will be the noble who does all of this that you have said to the one that I appoint. Hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai, the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Haman would have said, oh yeah, I know the guy. Oh yes, he does. When he heard those words, can you imagine the churning of the stomach, the sickness that felt so overwhelming he must have wanted to puke right then and there. Then he goes on to say, the king says, leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. Haman, you've given me a wonderful suggestion. Do it. But the man that you thought is to be the recipient of such honor ain't you. It's Mordecai. What a turn of events. What an amazing story this is. Poor Haman. I don't know what it must have been like for him to walk out of the king's presence. And by the way, remember, when you're in the king's presence, you don't want to look sad, ever. So he had to put on a face, if you will. And he had to leave the king's presence. And as soon as he turned around and walked out that door, and by the way, the king said, hurry. So I'm sure he hurried out of that inner throne room as far away from the king as he could get, so he could explode in hatred and vehement desire to kill and kill and kill again. But he couldn't. He had to do what the king now has commanded him. Well, so Haman, verse 11, took the robe and the horse, and he arrayed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. I have to stop there and wonder not only how hard it was for Haman to go to Mordecai in that gate where Mordecai would sit as one of the judges in the city of Shushan, but once he got there, I wonder when Mordecai looked up and saw Haman, did he think, uh-oh, what's going on now? Is he here to tell me that Esther failed in her attempt? Are we done for now? Is that what was going through his mind? Or did he notice something in Haman's countenance that might have indicated to him, there may be something good going on here? We're not told. But what about Haman? When he set eyes on Mordecai, can you imagine how difficult it must have been for him to speak to this man, humbling himself to say, Mordecai, I am here to give you a great honor from the king himself. You are to be clothed in the robe of the king. You are to be placed upon the king's steed, and you are to be paraded throughout the city. And I am to lead you in that parade, in that procession, and to make a proclamation, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. How hard would it have been for Haman to get those words out? I can't tell how I would have loved to have been there. I just so would love to have seen both of their looks on their faces. Well, it tells us, though, in verse 12, after that great procession, and we're not told anything about the procession itself other than the fact that they had to do it, but it was done, and then it was over. And verse 12 continues by saying, afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate. He went back to work. You know, he's a humble man. He's not puffed up. He's not proud above anything that he should be thinking above himself more than he ought to think. That's what Paul tells us, by the way, in the New Testament. Don't think anything of yourself more highly than you ought to think. And I believe that was the case with Mordecai. He got over that particular parade, might have been even a little bit embarrassed about it, but he got off the steed and goes right back to work. Haman, on the other hand, had a problem. And he went back, it tells us in verse 12, he hurried to his house. I should say so. He probably wanted to throw up. He hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. He was sick to his stomach, beyond belief. Verse 13 continues and says, and when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely be falling before him. They didn't even know for sure until now that he is a Jew. But they suspect it to be so. If he is of Jewish descent, you're in trouble, Mordecai is a man who has been honored by the king. And if he is a Jew, then there's trouble ahead for you, Haman. They knew that. It's more or less a prophetic statement that they are making. And again, I think God was in this. The condemnation comes to Haman on that early morning experience from his own wife and his friends, his counselors. Finally, the last verse in chapter 6 says, while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Now, much has happened so far in this day. Not exactly sure how long it would have taken him for the parade to have happened, perhaps several hours. But now it's later in the day, perhaps in the afternoon, and the king's eunuchs have come. Come, Haman, prepare yourself. You were invited. Make sure that you're ready to come to the banquet which Esther has prepared. That is something that we'll look at the next time. We know that Haman's in trouble, but the worst is yet to come for him, and great victory on behalf of God's people is yet to come as well. And I'm convinced that this story is a shadow of the people of God in our present day. The best is yet to come. But for the people of God, there is much trouble ahead. Hamas is only one part of their story. There are many other threats that they are facing and will have to continue to face and will face in the future. And the Lord knows about them all. And though they are going to experience a great deal of tribulation, they will know in the end, but God is with them. We'll see how that story continues with respect to Mordecai and Esther the next time, which, by the way, won't be next week. We're going to be taking the next week off. So I'll see you on next Thursday night in 2 weeks' time. So till then, my friends, grace and peace. God bless you all.